The auction house on Ettrick. 5 reeked of misery and desperation. Dim overhead lights cast a sickly glow on the cold, metallic floors, while the air buzzed with the sound of jeering bidders and the faint hum of restraining fields. Rows of captives stood in a line, each marked by chains or glowing collars that signified their status as property. Among them, Liaxis stood tall, her azure skin gleaming faintly even under the grimy lights, the natural star-like freckles on her face a stark reminder of her Ceruvian heritage. To the auctioneer, she was a prize. To the crowd, she was a rarity to exploit. To herself, she was neither. She was simply a survivor. Lot 89, the auctioneer called, gesturing toward her with a flourish. His bionic arm gleamed as he waved toward the audience, his voice sharp enough to cut through the chaos. A Ceruvian female in excellent condition. Unbroken, untrained. Pure. Opening bid. 500 credits. The crowd's murmurs turned to excitement, the word Ceruvian sparking greed in the eyes of traders, slavers, and opportunists. Liaxis' kind was rare now. Her people, once a thriving race of explorers and artisans, had been scattered and hunted after the destruction of Ceruvia during the Turbex Wars. Those who survived were often taken as slaves, their luminous skin and otherworldly beauty making them highly sought after. She stood motionless, her chin raised high. If she was to be sold, she would give them no satisfaction of seeing her broken. Her wrists bore the raw marks of her shackles, but she ignored the pain. What was another scar to someone who had already lost everything? 700, a voice from the front shouted. 800. The bids climbed rapidly, but Liaxi didn't flinch. Her gaze swept across the crowd, noting every leering face and calculating expression. Each one made her stomach churn, but she forced her expression to remain defiant. She had survived the destruction of her home. She had endured the chains and cruelty of her captors. She could endure this, too. Then, a new voice rang out, calm yet commanding. 1,000 credits. The crowd stilled, heads turning toward the speaker. At the back of the room stood a human man, his presence incongruous among the garish display of wealth and power. He wore a simple leather jacket over a black shirt, his boots scuffed from use. His dark hair was unkempt, his beard scruffy, but his eyes were sharp and steady. The auctioneer hesitated, clearly caught off guard. Humans were rare in this part of the galaxy, and even rarer at an event like this. A human, he said, his tone dripping with disdain. What could you possibly want with a Ceruvian? The man didn't flinch. 2,000 credits, he said, his voice even, unbothered by the auctioneer's sneer. Liaxi's eyes narrowed. Was this some kind of ploy? Humans weren't known for their altruism, and those who ventured this far from their own systems were usually mercenaries or smugglers. The auctioneer recovered, his lips curling into a greedy smile. 2,000 credits. That's quite a bid for such a modest appearance. Surely you. 5,000, the man interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a tense silence. No one countered. Even the wealthiest traders hesitated to challenge a bid that high for a single captive. The auctioneer slammed his gavel down, his bionic hand twitching in annoyance. Sold. Lot 89 goes to the human. 2 guards approached Liaxi, unlocking her chains with quick, practiced movements. She staggered slightly as the weight fell away, her legs unsteady from days of confinement. She glared at the human as he stepped forward, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that unsettled her. You're free now, he said, holding out a hand. She didn't move. Free? She asked, her voice sharp. You paid 5,000 credits for me. That doesn't sound like freedom. The man tilted his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. It does if you walk out of here on your own terms. The choice is yours. The crowd murmured behind them, their displeasure evident. Humans weren't welcome here, and this man's actions had only deepened their scorn. Liaxi's instinct screamed at her to be wary, but something in his voice, steady and without expectation, stilled her doubts. With slow, deliberate movements, she placed her hand in his. His grip was warm and steady, a stark contrast to the cold indifference she had grown used to. The guard stepped aside, and the two of them walked toward the exit. The crowd parted reluctantly, their glares like daggers in Liaxi's back. As they reached the open air, the harsh artificial light of the auction house gave way to the cool glow of Etric Five's twin moons. The scent of metal and grime was replaced by the faint tang of ozone from the distant industrial fields. "What's your angle?" Liaxi asked, her voice cutting through the silence. The man stopped and turned to face her. "My name's Mark," he said, "and I don't have an angle. I just couldn't leave you there." She crossed her arms, skepticism etched into every line of her face. "You expect me to believe that? No one pays 5,000 credits out of kindness." "Maybe I'm just bad with money," Mark said with a shrug, his lips quirking into a wry smile. Liaxi stared at him, searching for the lie. She found none, which only frustrated her more. "Fine, but if this is a trick, you'll regret it." "Noted," Mark replied, gesturing toward a modest starship parked nearby. Its hull was battered but sturdy, its design practical rather than sleek. As they boarded, Liaxi paused at the threshold, glancing back toward the auction house. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in years, she felt the faintest flicker of control over her fate. The doors closed behind her with a hiss, sealing her past firmly on the other side. The hum of the ship's engines filled the small cabin, a steady vibration that Liaxi felt under her feet as she stood uncertainly in the entryway. The air inside the vessel smelled faintly of oil and something herbal, perhaps tea. It was a modest ship, clearly more function than flair. The walls bore scratches and scorch marks, evidence of past scuffles, but everything seemed meticulously maintained. Mark moved ahead of her, shedding his jacket and tossing it over the back of a worn chair. "Welcome aboard the Horizon. It's not much, but it's home," he said without looking back. Liaxi followed slowly, her gaze sweeping the space. The cockpit opened into a compact common area with a metal table bolted to the floor and two chairs that had seen better days. To one side, a narrow hallway led to what she assumed were sleeping quarters and storage. Despite its utilitarian design, the space felt lived in, almost comfortable. She crossed her arms, her voice sharp. "What now? Do you expect gratitude? Because you won't get it." Mark turned, leaning casually against the table. "Gratitude isn't what I'm after," he said. "But you're welcome to sit, eat, or rest. Whatever you need." His calm demeanor irritated her. She wanted a reason to hate him, to distrust him, but he offered nothing. Instead, he moved to a small console, pressing a button to activate the ship's autopilot. The engines shifted, their hum softening, and the ship rose into the atmosphere with a smoothness that spoke of careful piloting. "Where are we going?" she asked, her tone cautious. Mark glanced at her, then back to the controls. "Away from Etric 5, for starters. Beyond that, I figured I'd ask where you wanted to go." She blinked, caught off guard. "You bought me, and now you're letting me decide." "Bought isn't the word I'd use," Mark said, crossing his arms. "I paid for your freedom, not your ownership. There's a difference." Liaxi's jaw tightened. "So, I'm just supposed to trust you? To believe you're some noble human with no agenda?" "You don't have to trust me," he said, his voice steady but firm. "But I'm not locking you up. I'm not forcing you to do anything. And I'm not selling you to the next highest bidder. That's all I've got to offer." His words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Liaxi hesitated, her instincts warring with the faint glimmer of hope his actions had ignited. She lowered herself into one of the chairs, the cold metal uncomfortable against her skin. "Why were you at the auction?" she asked, her tone softer, but no less wary. Mark took a seat across from her, his posture relaxed. "I was trading for parts. Didn't know there was an auction until I saw the crowd. Then I saw you, and well," he shrugged. "I couldn't walk away." Her eyes narrowed. "That's it? You expect me to believe you risked 5,000 credits and who knows what consequences because of some whim?" "Not a whim," he said quietly. "I don't stand by while people are treated like cargo. Not anymore." The weight in his voice caught her off guard. It wasn't a boast or a plea for admiration. It was the kind of statement born from experience, perhaps even guilt. "What happened to you?" she asked, surprising herself. Mark hesitated, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. Another time, he said, rising from his seat. You hungry? The abrupt shift left her frustrated, but she didn't press. Instead, she watched as he rummaged through a storage unit, pulling out a sealed packet and tossing it her way. She caught it instinctively. What is this? She asked, turning the packet over. Field rations. Not gourmet, but they'll keep you alive. Liaxi ripped the packet open, inspecting the contents. A protein bar, some dried fruits, and a small pouch of water. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd been given in weeks. She ate cautiously, her sharp eyes never leaving Mark. Why do you hate auctions so much? She asked between bites. He leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. Because I've seen what happens to the people sold at them. I've seen what it does to them. Liaxi stilled, the food in her hand forgotten. And you think you're different? That rescuing me makes you some kind of hero. No, he said, his voice quiet but resolute. I don't care if you see me as a hero. I care that you're not standing on that platform anymore. She didn't know how to respond. The sincerity in his tone unsettled her more than any lie could have. A sudden jolt shook the ship, throwing her against the table. Alarms blared, and red lights bathed the cabin. What the hell was that? Liaxi demanded. Mark was already moving, his hands flying across the controls. Tracking beacon. They must have tagged you before the auction. Her stomach dropped. What does that mean? It means someone's coming for you, he said grimly. And we need to be gone before they get here. The ship lurched as Mark pushed it into a steep climb, aiming for the edge of the planet's atmosphere. Liaxi gripped the table, her heart pounding. Who are they? She asked. Depends, Mark said, his tone clipped. Could be slavers. Could be bounty hunters. Either way, they're not here for a friendly chat. Her breath caught as the ship's sensors lit up, indicating an incoming vessel. Mark swore under his breath, his fingers flying over the controls. You said you weren't locking me up, she snapped. But it seems like you've got me running for my life instead. Would you rather I left you on Ettrick 5? He shot back, his eyes fixed on the controls. She didn't answer. The pursuing ship appeared on the sensors, gaining quickly. Mark's hands tightened on the controls as he maneuvered into a debris field orbiting the planet. The ship jerked violently as they dodged chunks of metal and rock. Liaxi watched him, her fear mingling with grudging respect. His focus was absolute, his movements precise. He wasn't just some wandering human. He knew exactly what he was doing. The pursuing ship fired, a burst of plasma streaking past them. Mark cursed, pulling them into a sharp dive. Liaxi's stomach churned, but she kept her gaze on the sensors. Got any weapons on this thing? She asked. Not the kind that'll take down a ship, he said through gritted teeth. Great, she muttered, gripping the edge of the console as the ship shuddered again. Mark's hands flew over the controls one last time. Hold on, he said, his voice calm despite the chaos. The ship lurched violently as he brought it into a narrow gap between two massive chunks of debris. The pursuing vessel followed, but miscalculated, colliding with the edge of the field. Liaxi stared at the screen as the blip disappeared. Mark exhaled, his shoulders slumping. We're clear. For now. Liaxi sat back, her heart still racing. She glanced at Mark, a question forming on her lips, but swallowed it. For the first time, she didn't know what to say. Mark turned to her, his expression unreadable. You wanted to know why I hate auctions? That's why. They don't let people go, even when someone tries. Liaxi didn't reply, but for the first time, she wondered if there was more to Mark than she had assumed. The silence aboard the horizon was heavier than the void outside. After the chaos of their escape, the absence of noise felt unnatural. Liaxi leaned against the cold metal wall of the common area, her sharp eyes flicking over the room as though expecting danger to materialize from the shadows. The hum of the ship's systems was the only sound, but it offered no comfort. It was too regular, too mechanical. Mark sat across from her at the metal table, his posture relaxed, but his expression guarded. He toyed absently with a small wrench, spinning it between his fingers. The steady rhythm of the motion grated on Liaxi's nerves, each click of the tool against the table sharpening her irritation. Do you ever stop fidgeting? She snapped, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. Mark looked up, startled, then smirked. Do you ever stop scowling? She didn't dignify his remark with a reply, but the corner of her mouth twitched despite herself. That annoyed her even more. After a beat of silence, she crossed her arms and leveled her gaze at him. Why did you really do it? Buy me back there? I'm not some helpless thing you can rescue for a pat on the back. Mark set the wrench down, leaning back in his chair. His eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. I didn't say you were helpless. Then why? She pressed. He exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath that seemed to carry the weight of something unspoken. Because I've seen what happens to people who don't get out. Liaxi arched an eyebrow, her suspicion sharpening. People like me? People like my sister, Mark said softly. The room seemed to shrink, the air pressing tighter around them. Liaxi leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting from suspicion to curiosity. Your sister? Mark nodded, his jaw tightening. For a moment, he stared at the table as though weighing how much to say. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady, as though recounting a story he had repeated to himself 100 times. Her name was Nina. We grew up on a mining colony in the Rim territories. Not much there but rocks and dust, but we made do. She was sharp, stubborn, and always looking out for me, even though I was older. I thought I'd keep her safe. He paused, his hand tightening into a fist. Then the raid started. Slavers. Pirates. Didn't matter what you called them. They came, took what they wanted, and left ashes behind. One day, they took her. Liaxi's stomach tightened. She knew where this was going, but she didn't interrupt. I spent months trying to find her, Mark continued. Tracked down leads, bribed smugglers, even infiltrated a slaver's den once. By the time I found her, his voice faltered, but he pushed on. She was gone. They'd worked her to death in some or camp. Didn't even have the decency to bury her. The silence that followed was oppressive. Liaxi's gaze softened, her usual sharpness giving way to something gentler. She understood loss, knew its bite all too well. I'm sorry, she said quietly, the words feeling heavy on her tongue. Mark nodded, but his eyes remained distant. That's why I don't turn away. Not when I can stop it. Liaxi studied him, her defenses wavering. She had been prepared to hate him, to see him as another opportunist, but his pain was real. Still, trust didn't come easily. That doesn't mean I owe you anything, she said, her tone firm but less hostile. I don't expect you to, Mark replied, his voice calm. But it means I'll keep you safe, whether you like it or not. She huffed, leaning back against the wall. You've got a savior complex, you know that? Maybe, he said with a faint smirk. The tension eased slightly, the air between them less combative but still charged. Mark stood, stretching his arms. You can keep interrogating me later. Right now, I need to make sure this ship doesn't fall apart mid-flight. Liaxi watched as he disappeared into the hallway, heading toward the engine room. For a moment, she considered staying put, letting him handle it alone. But curiosity, and perhaps something deeper, nudged her to follow. The engine room was cramped, its walls lined with cables, panels, and pipes that hissed faintly with pressure. Mark crouched near the central power core, his hands deep in a mess of wires. Need a hand? Liaxi asked, leaning against the doorframe. Mark glanced up, surprised. You offering? Don't read too much into it, she said, stepping into the room. I just want to know how this thing works, in case you get yourself killed and leave me stranded. He chuckled. Fair enough. Grab that panel over there. Liaxi knelt beside him, her fingers brushing against the cool metal of the panel. As he explained the ship's systems, she found herself drawn in despite her reluctance. His voice was steady, his instructions clear. She had never cared about machinery before, but the way he spoke made it seem almost alive. Plasma flows unstable here, he said, pointing to a glowing coil. If it overheats, we're toast. Comforting, Liaxi muttered, earning another chuckle. As they worked, their movements grew more synchronized, the silence between them punctuated only by the occasional question or sarcastic comment. For the first time since her escape, Liaxi felt something close to calm. When the repairs were done, Mark leaned back on his heels, wiping his hands on a rag. Not bad for someone who doesn't trust me, he said with a grin. She rolled her eyes, but couldn't hide her faint smile. Don't get used to it. Mark stood, offering her a hand. She hesitated for a moment before taking it, allowing him to pull her to her feet. As they returned to the common area, Liaxi glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. So, what's the plan now? Find somewhere safe to lay low, Mark said. Figure out our next move from there. Safe doesn't exist, Liaxi said, her voice tinged with bitterness. Maybe not, Mark replied, but safer does. And it's a start. She didn't argue, but her mind churned with questions. Safe for how long? And at what cost? The stars stretched endlessly outside the ship's windows, their cold light a stark contrast to the warmth growing between them. Liaxi still didn't trust him entirely, but for the first time, she felt the smallest flicker of something unfamiliar. Hope. The horizon drifted in the quiet safety of the asteroid field, its engines idling low to conserve energy. The cabin lights cast a warm, dim glow over the common area, softening the edges of the ship's rugged interior. Liaxi sat cross-legged on the floor, her back against the cold wall, her azure skin shimmering faintly in the ambient light. Her freckles, glowing like faint constellations, seemed to flicker as she stared at nothing in particular. Mark leaned over the ship's central console, running diagnostics with one hand while sipping from a steaming metal mug in the other. His movements were efficient, practiced, but there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. Are we clear? Liaxi finally asked, breaking the silence. Mark glanced over his shoulder, his eyes meeting hers. For now. No sign of pursuit, but that doesn't mean they've given up. Liaxi nodded, her expression unreadable. They never do. Mark's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he turned back to the console. You could get some rest, he said. It's been a long day. Liaxi let out a short, humorless laugh. I don't rest. Not well anyway. Mark set his mug down, the metal clinking softly against the console. You're safe here, he said, his voice quieter now. At least for tonight. Safe. The word felt foreign to Liaxi, like a language she didn't speak. She shifted uncomfortably, the scars on her wrists a reminder of how fleeting safety could be. Safety is an illusion, she said, her tone sharper than she intended. Mark turned to face her fully, leaning against the console. Maybe, he said, folding his arms. But it's better than nothing. Their eyes met, a silent challenge passing between them. Liaxi wasn't used to being looked at the way Mark looked at her, like she was a person, not a commodity. It unsettled her. You're different, she said suddenly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Mark raised an eyebrow. Different how? Different from the others, she said, gesturing vaguely. The ones who buy people. Use them. You don't act like them. Mark's jaw tightened. That's because I'm not like them. The air between them grew heavier, charged with something neither of them wanted to name. Liaxi studied him, her sharp eyes taking in the faint lines of exhaustion on his face, the way his hand gripped the edge of the console like he was grounding himself. You carry something, she said, her voice softer now. Something heavy. Mark exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Don't we all? Liaxi tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. What is it? Mark hesitated, the words caught in his throat. He wanted to deflect, to turn the conversation away from himself. But the intensity in her eyes made it impossible. I told you about my sister, he said finally. But what I didn't say is that I was the one who convinced her to stay on that colony. I thought we'd be safe there. I thought I could protect her. Liaxi's expression softened, the edges of her usual sharpness blurring. It wasn't your fault, she said, surprising herself with the gentleness in her tone. Mark laughed bitterly. Tell that to her. Liaxi shifted, pushing herself to her feet. She crossed the small space between them, her movements slow but deliberate. When she stood in front of him, Mark straightened, his eyes searching hers for some kind of answer. You blame yourself, she said quietly. But you're still trying. That means something. Mark looked away, the weight of her words settling over him. Sometimes it feels like it doesn't. Liaxi reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm. The contact was light, hesitant, but it was enough to make him look at her again. It does to me, she said, her voice steady. The room seemed to shrink around them, the silence filled with unspoken words. Mark's gaze dropped to her hand, then back to her face. Her freckles glowed softly, their light reflecting in his eyes. "You've been through hell," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "So have you," she replied. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, Mark leaned down, his forehead brushing against hers. Liaxi didn't pull away. Instead, she tilted her head, her breath mingling with his. "This is dangerous," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Everything is," Mark replied. The space between them vanished as their lips met, the kiss tentative at first but quickly deepening. Mark's hands found her waist, pulling her closer, while Liaxi's fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt. The world outside the ship, the dangers lurking in the shadows, all of it faded away in that moment. Liaxi's glowing freckles brightened as her emotions surged, casting faint patterns of light across Mark's face. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. She nodded, her cheeks flushed. I haven't felt like this in a long time." Mark smiled, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're not alone anymore." The words hit her like a punch to the chest. She had spent so long guarding herself, building walls to keep everyone out. But in Mark's arms, those walls began to crack. "I don't know if I can trust this," she admitted. "You don't have to," Mark said. "Not yet." He kissed her again, slower this time, as if to prove that there was no rush, no expectation. Liaxi let herself sink into the moment, her usual vigilance giving way to something softer, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. For the first time since Saruvia's fall, she felt like she wasn't fighting alone. And for now, that was enough. The horizon drifted in the quiet of deep space, its engines powered down to avoid detection. The endless darkness outside the viewport was broken only by pinpricks of light, stars that seemed indifferent to the struggles of those who lived beneath them. Inside the ship, however, the air simmered with an intensity neither of its passengers fully understood. Mark stood in the small kitchenette, a steaming cup of tea in his hands. He stared at the swirling liquid, as if the motion might reveal some clarity to the thoughts jumbled in his head. The last few days had been a whirlwind of pursuit, violence, and uneasy camaraderie. And Liaxi was at the center of it all, a force of nature who unsettled and intrigued him in equal measure. "You always stand there brooding, or is this just for me?" Liaxi's voice cut through the quiet. Mark turned, startled to find her leaning in the doorway. Her arms were crossed, and the faint glow of her star-freckled skin illuminated her face in the dim light. She looked both weary and unyielding, a contradiction that seemed to define her. "I'm not brooding," he said, though the defensive tone in his voice made it sound like a lie. She smirked and stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the metal floor. "Right? Just standing in the dark with your tea, staring into nothing. Totally normal." He set the mug down with a soft clink. "You always have to get the last word, don't you?" "Only when I'm right," she shot back, her grin sharp. Mark sighed, but couldn't help the small smile that tugged at the corner of his lips. Liaxi had a way of disarming him that no one else ever managed, and it both irritated and fascinated him. "Shouldn't you be resting?" he asked, folding his arms. She shrugged. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd check on the great improviser. You seemed off after the chase." Mark leaned back against the counter, his expression softening. "I'm fine. Just thinking." Liaxi tilted her head, studying him. "About what?" He hesitated. "About what happens next." Her smile faded, replaced by a guarded look. "You're worried they'll come after us again." "I'd be an idiot not to," he admitted. "We got lucky out there, but luck runs out." Liaxi stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking. "You're not the only one who's had to run. You think I don't know how this works?" Mark met her gaze, and for a moment, the weight of their shared experiences hung between them. The air felt heavier, charged with something neither of them could quite name. "You shouldn't have to run," he said quietly. Liaxi's jaw tightened. "Neither should you. But here we are." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, but filled with unspoken truths. Mark's gaze flicked to her hands, which rested at her sides but curled slightly, as though bracing for something. "You don't trust me," he said, breaking the quiet. She snorted softly. "Trust is a luxury I can't afford." Mark's lips pressed into a thin line. "Maybe you should try it sometime." Her eyes narrowed, but not in anger. "Trust gets you killed. Or worse." "Not always," he said, his voice steady. Liaxi stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "What makes you so sure?" "Because you're still here," he replied, his tone soft but unwavering. The words hung in the air, and something in her defenses cracked. She didn't look away, didn't deflect with a sharp comment or a roll of her eyes. Instead, she stayed rooted in place, her breath shallow but steady. Mark didn't move, letting her decide what came next. The tension between them was no longer about survival or escape, but something more intimate, something raw and unspoken. Liaxi took another step forward, closing the distance between them until she was close enough to see the faint stubble on his jaw, the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. "Why do you care so much?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark's eyes searched hers, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "Because someone has to." The word struck something deep within her. Before she could second-guess herself, she closed the remaining space between them, her hand reaching up to rest lightly against his chest. His heart beat steady and strong beneath her palm, grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. Mark didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, he placed his hand gently over hers, his touch warm and reassuring. For a moment, they stood like that, suspended in a fragile stillness that felt both infinite and fleeting. "You're impossible," Liaxi murmured, though there was no venom in her tone. "Good thing you like impossible," Mark replied with a faint smile. Liaxi rolled her eyes, but the motion lacked its usual bite. She dropped her hand, stepping back, though not as far as she might have before. "I don't need you to save me," she said, her voice firm but lacking the sharpness it once held. Mark nodded. "I know, but I'm here anyway." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before she turned toward the doorway. "Get some rest, Mark. You're going to need it." As she walked away, Mark leaned back against the counter, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't quite name. He watched her go, her luminous freckles fading into the shadows of the hallway. In the quiet that followed, he picked up his tea, now lukewarm, and took a sip. The bitterness grounded him, reminding him that whatever came next, he wasn't facing it alone. And for the first time in years, that thought didn't scare him. The horizon hurtled toward the distant edge of an asteroid belt, its engines running low to minimize detection. Inside the ship, Mark and Liaxi worked in tense silence, their focus split between repairing systems damaged during the last skirmish and preparing for the next inevitable encounter. Mark was bent over a console in the cockpit, rerouting power to reinforce the shields. Sparks flew as he adjusted a frayed cable, muttering under his breath. Liaxi stood behind him, arms crossed, her sharp gaze fixed on the star map. "Do you always fix things by nearly breaking them first?" she asked, her tone laced with mockery. Mark didn't look up. "You've got better ideas, I'm all ears." "Try not using tools like a blunt weapon," she shot back. "Noted," he replied, though the corner of his mouth twitched into a faint smile. Liaxi shook her head, turning back to the map. "We need to stop soon. The fuel reserves won't last much longer." Mark glanced at the readings. "There's a station near the belt. We can dock, refuel, and grab supplies." She frowned. "You trust a station that close to slaver territory?" "Trust? No. But I know how to blend in," he said. Liaxi raised an eyebrow. "Says the guy who stood out enough to spend 5,000 credits on a Ceruvian at an auction." "Touché," Mark admitted, standing upright. "But this isn't my first time dodging trouble. I'll handle it." Liaxi's skepticism was evident, but she didn't argue. She knew better than to waste energy fighting when resources were dwindling. The station loomed ahead, its exterior a chaotic web of scaffolding, blinking lights, and patched hulls from countless repairs. Ships of every shape and size docked at various ports, the movement around the station a hive of commerce and clandestine dealings. Mark guided the horizon into an open berth, keeping his posture relaxed as they docked. Liaxi, however, remained tense, her eyes scanning the viewport for potential threats. "You stay here," Mark said as the docking clamps engaged. "Not a chance," Liaxi replied. "It's safer," he insisted. "For you or me," she countered. Mark sighed, recognizing the futility of arguing. "Fine, but follow my lead. Keep your head down and don't pick any fights." "Maybe you should follow my lead," she said, her tone daring him to argue. Mark didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he grabbed his jacket and stepped into the airlock. Liaxi followed, her steps silent but purposeful. The station's interior was a maze of narrow corridors, dimly lit and filled with the hum of machinery. The air was thick with the scent of oil, ozone, and unwashed bodies, a sensory assault that spoke of the station's dual nature, both a haven and a trap. Mark led the way to a supply depot, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Liaxi stayed close, her sharp gaze catching every suspicious glance and lingering stare. "Do they always look at you like that?" she muttered. Mark smirked. "Only when I'm with someone prettier than me." She rolled her eyes, but the tension in her shoulders eased slightly. At the depot, Mark handed over credits for fuel and rations while Liaxi watched the crowd. Her instincts prickled as a group of rough-looking traders entered the space. Their clothes were nondescript, but the way they moved, too coordinated, too deliberate, set her on edge. "Mark," she murmured, stepping closer. He didn't look up from the transaction. "I see them." The traders fanned out, their eyes scanning the room. One of them, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, locked eyes with Liaxi. His expression shifted, recognition flickering across his face. "We need to leave," she said, her voice low but urgent. Mark finished the payment, grabbing the supplies. "Agreed." They moved toward the exit, keeping their pace steady but quick. The traders followed, their movements growing more aggressive. As they reached the docking bay, one of the traders called out, "Ceruvian, stop right there." Liaxi froze for a split second before bolting toward the ship. Mark cursed under his breath, pulling her along as the traders shouted and gave chase. "Keep going," Mark shouted, his voice sharp. Liaxi didn't hesitate. She reached the horizon first, slamming the hatch controls as Mark dove in behind her. The door sealed with a hiss, muffling the pounding footsteps outside. "Strap in," Mark yelled, sprinting to the cockpit. Liaxi followed, throwing herself into the co-pilot seat as the engines roared to life. The station's alarms blared, but Mark was already maneuvering the ship out of the berth. "They're scrambling fighters," Liaxi warned, her eyes on the sensors. Mark clenched his jaw. "Let them. We're faster." The horizon shot away from the station, weaving through the chaos of incoming and outgoing ships. Plasma fire streaked past them as the pursuing fighters opened fire. "Shields are holding," Liaxi reported, her hands flying over the controls. "Not for long," Mark muttered. "I need you to reroute auxiliary power to the engines." She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the console. "That'll drain the weapons." "I know," he said. "Do it." Liaxi's fingers moved quickly, diverting power as the ship surged forward, leaving the fighters struggling to keep up. The asteroids loomed ahead, their jagged surfaces reflecting the light of distant stars. Mark steered the ship into the field, using the debris as cover. The fighters hesitated, unwilling to risk the dangerous terrain. "We're clear," Liaxi said after a tense moment, her voice tinged with relief. Mark slumped back in his seat, his grip on the controls relaxing. That was too close. Liaxi turned to him, her expression serious. "You think this will stop them?" "No," he admitted. "But it buys us time." She leaned back, her gaze fixed on the stars outside. "Time isn't enough." Mark looked at her, the exhaustion in her voice cutting deeper than any argument. "We'll find a way, Liaxi. We have to." She didn't answer, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. For now, they had survived. And for the first time, survival felt like something more than just a delaying tactic. It felt like a victory. As the horizon slipped deeper into the void, the stars outside seemed a little brighter, their light a reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope still lingered. The horizon hung in the orbit of a crimson planet, its engines idling in the quiet vastness of space. Inside, the air was still, thick with anticipation. Liaxi stood by the viewport, her azure skin bathed in the eerie glow of the planet below. Her luminous freckles shimmered faintly, reflecting the nervous energy coursing through her. Mark entered the cockpit, his boots tapping softly on the metal floor. He carried a datapad in one hand, his expression serious but calm. It's confirmed. The signal came from here. Whoever's tracking us is on the surface. Liaxi didn't turn, her eyes fixed on the swirling storms of red and gold that raged across the planet's atmosphere. Do you think they know we're here? They'd have to be blind not to, Mark replied, setting the datapad on the console. But we can't run forever. It ends here. Liaxi finally turned to face him, her gaze steady. And if it doesn't? Mark met her eyes, his voice resolute. Then we make it end. She studied him for a moment, the weight of their journey etched into every line of her face. The weeks they had spent evading slavers, fighting bounty hunters, and navigating the precarious balance of trust had forged something between them, something she still struggled to name but couldn't deny. Fine, she said, her voice firm. But we do this together. Mark smiled, the faint curve of his lips tinged with relief. Wouldn't have it any other way. The landing was rough, the planet's turbulent winds battering the horizon as it descended through the atmosphere. Mark gripped the controls tightly, his jaw clenched, while Liaxi monitored the sensors. Landing zone's clear, she reported, though her tone betrayed her unease. Let's hope it stays that way, Mark muttered, guiding the ship onto a rocky plateau. When the horizon finally settled, the silence that followed was almost deafening. Mark powered down the engines and turned to Liaxi. You ready for this? She secured the plasma pistol at her hip, her expression determined. Always. They stepped out onto the plateau, the air thick with metallic tang and the scent of ozone. The sky above churned with violent clouds, casting shifting shadows over the barren landscape. Liaxi scanned the horizon, her sharp eyes catching a glint of movement near the edge of a rocky outcrop. We're not alone. Mark followed her gaze. A lone figure emerged from the shadows, their silhouette sharp against the stormy backdrop. As they drew closer, details came into focus. A tall figure clad in dark armor, their face obscured by a helmet that glinted faintly in the crimson light. Liaxi Varen, the figure called, their voice distorted but unmistakably female. You've been a thorn in the side of powerful people for far too long. Liaxi stepped forward, her voice unwavering. Then maybe they should have left me alone. The figure tilted her head, a chuckle reverberating through the helmet. You don't understand your value, do you? The Ceruvian bloodline is almost extinct. People like you aren't just rare, they're priceless. Mark moved to stand beside Liaxi, his hand hovering near his holster. She's not a commodity, he said, his tone sharp. And she's not going anywhere with you. The figure's helmet shifted toward him. And you're the human who thinks he can play savior. How quaint. Without warning, the figure drew a weapon, its barrel glowing with ominous energy. Liaxi reacted instantly, raising her pistol and firing a precise shot that struck the ground near the figure's feet. The woman laughed again, stepping back into the cover of the rocks. This isn't over, Liaxi. The galaxy will always hunt you, no matter how far you run. Her voice echoed as she disappeared into the shadows, her presence vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Liaxi lowered her pistol, her breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She's not wrong, she said quietly. Mark turned to her, his expression firm. Maybe not, but that doesn't mean you face it alone. Liaxi glanced at him, the weight of his words settling in her chest. For so long, she had carried the burden of survival on her own, trusting no one, relying on nothing but her own resilience. Yet here was someone willing to stand beside her, not out of obligation or pity, but out of something deeper. Back aboard the horizon, the tension lingered, though the immediate danger had passed. Liaxi sat in the cockpit, staring out at the stormy planet below. Mark joined her, a cup of tea in his hands. He offered it to her without a word. She took it, the warmth seeping into her fingers as she cradled the cup. "Do you really think we can outrun them forever?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Mark shook his head. "No, but I think we can outlast them." Liaxi smiled faintly, the first genuine smile she had allowed herself in days. "You're impossible. And you're stubborn," he said with a grin. She leaned back in her seat, her gaze shifting from the planet to the stars beyond. "Maybe that's why this works." Mark didn't reply immediately. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The gesture was simple, but it spoke volumes. "It does work," he said finally, his voice steady. "And as long as it does, we'll keep fighting." Liaxi turned her hand, letting her fingers intertwine with his. The bond they had forged was unorthodox, born out of desperation and survival, but it was real. And in the vast, indifferent expanse of the galaxy, it was enough. As the horizon ascended back into the stars, the weight of their pasts felt a little lighter. For the first time, Liaxi felt that she wasn't running toward another battle, but toward the possibility of something more, something worth fighting for. The stars shimmered around them, a testament to the infinite possibilities that lay ahead. Together, they would face whatever came next, tethered by their shared defiance and the fragile but unbreakable connection they had found in one another.